The blood on her dress had long since dried to rust by the time she collapsed at the edge of the creek, her hands shaking so badly she could barely cup the water to her cracked lips. Zinnia Vaughn had been walking for 3 days through the Arizona Territory wilderness, and she had stopped believing she would see another sunrise hours ago. It was late September in 1883, and the night air carried a chill that cut through her thin cotton dress like a blade. She had left everything behind in Tucson, everything except the clothes on her back and the memory of what her husband's business partner had done. Thomas had been dead for 2 weeks when she discovered the truth, when Jacob Mercer had come to collect what he claimed Thomas owed, and when she had nothing to give, he had taken his payment in violence. She had run that very night, stealing away with only the moonlight to guide her, heading north toward anywhere that was not there. But 3 days of walking with no food and little water had stripped away her strength. The wilderness stretched endless in every direction, pinyon pines and juniper trees casting long shadows in the failing light. She could hear coyotes in the distance, their yips and howls a reminder that she was not alone out here, that things with teeth watched from the darkness. Zinnia pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, trying to conserve what little warmth remained in her body. The stars were beginning to emerge overhead, countless and cold and beautiful. She thought about Thomas, about how he had promised her a good life when they married 4 years ago, about how that promise had died along with him when a spooked horse kicked him in the chest outside the livery stable. She thought about her mother back in St. Louis, who had warned her against marrying a man heading west to seek his fortune. She thought about how right her mother had been. The tears came then, hot and bitter, streaming down her dirty cheeks. She was 23 years old and she was going to die out here alone, and no one would ever know what happened to her. Jacob Mercer would tell people she had run off, that grief had made her mad, and no one would question it because women were always running mad with grief in stories men told. She did not hear the horse approaching until it was nearly upon her. The animal snorted softly, and Zinnia's head snapped up, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. For one terrible moment she thought Jacob had found her, that he had tracked her all this way to finish what he had started. She tried to stand, but her legs would not hold her, and she fell back against the creek bank with a small cry of desperation. The rider dismounted in one smooth motion, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He was tall and broad-shouldered, silhouetted against the darkening sky, and as he moved closer, she could make out more details. Dark hair that touched his collar, a strong jaw shadowed with several days of stubble, eyes that caught the last of the daylight and reflected something she had not expected to see: concern. "Easy there," he said, his voice low and calm, the kind of voice you would use with a frightened animal. "I am not going to hurt you, madam." Zinnia pressed herself harder against the creek bank, her breath coming in short gasps. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her body had nothing left to give. The cowboy stopped several feet away, holding his hands up where she could see them. "My name is Tobias Langford," he said. "I have a ranch about 5 miles east of here, just outside Eager. I was heading home when I saw you from the ridge." She stared at him, trying to make her exhausted mind work, trying to decide if she should believe him. He did not move closer, did not make any threatening gestures. He just stood there in the growing darkness, waiting. "You are hurt," he said after a moment, and it was not a question. His eyes had found the bruises on her face, the ones that had faded from purple to yellow-green over the past days. "And you have been walking a long time, judging by your shoes." Zinnia looked down at her feet. Her boots were nearly worn through, the leather split and caked with dried mud and blood from blisters that had burst and reformed a dozen times. "I have water," Tobias said. He slowly reached for the canteen hanging from his belt, moving deliberately so as not to startle her. And food. You look like you could use both. Her throat was so dry it hurt to swallow, and her stomach had stopped growling hours ago, settling into a hollow ache that made her feel light-headed and strange. She watched as he set the canteen on the ground and then stepped back, giving her space to take it if she wanted. "Go on," he said gently. "It is clean, I promise you." Zinnia crawled forward on her hands and knees, not trusting her legs to hold her, and grabbed the canteen. She drank deeply, the cool water flooding her mouth and throat, and she had to force herself to stop before she made herself sick. When she lowered the canteen, she found Tobias had crouched down to her level, maintaining that careful distance. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then whispered, "Zinnia. Zinnia Vaughn." "That is a pretty name," he said, and there was nothing flirtatious or inappropriate in the way he said it, just a simple observation. "Zinnia, it is going to be full dark soon, and these hills are not safe at night. Will you let me take you somewhere warm and safe? No strings, no expectations. Just a place to rest. Why would you help me?" The words came out rough and suspicious. Tobias was quiet for a moment, his eyes searching her face. "Because you need help," he said finally, "and because no one should have to face the night alone when they have lost hope." Something in those words broke through the wall of fear she had built around herself. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was the gentle steadiness in his voice, but Zinnia found herself nodding. "All right," she whispered. "All right." Tobias stood and moved to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding with kind eyes. "This is Copper," he said, stroking the animal's neck. "He is gentle as a lamb. Do you think you can ride, or would you rather I walk beside you?" "I can ride," Zinnia said, though she was not entirely sure it was true. She had ridden plenty of times when Thomas was alive, but that felt like another lifetime ago. Tobias helped her to her feet with a hand under her elbow, his touch careful and respectful. When her legs threatened to buckle, he steadied her without comment. He helped her into the saddle and then swung up behind her, leaving proper space between them, one arm loosely around her waist to keep her from falling. "The town is about an hour west," he said, "but my ranch is much closer, and I have a housekeeper who lives there, Mrs. Callahan. She is a fierce woman with a good heart. She will look after you proper." Zinnia nodded, too tired to argue or even really care where they went. She let herself lean back slightly against Tobias's solid presence, taking comfort in the fact that she was no longer alone in the gathering darkness. Copper moved at a steady, easy walk, and the rhythmic motion was almost soothing after days of stumbling on foot. "How long have you been out here?" Tobias asked after a while, his voice quiet. "3 days," Zinnia said. "I left Tucson 3 days ago." "That is a long walk." He paused. "You running from something or to something?" "From," she said, and her voice broke on the word. "Then you do not have to talk about it until you are ready," Tobias said, "or ever if you prefer. Your business is your own." They rode in silence after that, and Zinnia watched the landscape transform in the moonlight. The rough desert terrain gradually gave way to rolling hills dotted with more trees, and in the distance, she could see the dark shapes of mountains against the starlit sky. The air smelled of sage and pine and something else, something clean and wild that made her chest ache with an emotion she could not name. When they finally arrived at the ranch, Zinnia was barely conscious, drifting in and out of awareness. She had a vague impression of a sturdy log house with warm light glowing from the windows, of Tobias calling out for Mrs. Callahan, of being helped down from the horse by strong, careful hands. "Mother of mercy," a woman's voice said, sharp with concern. "What happened to this poor child?" "Found her by the creek," Tobias said. "She has been walking for days. She needs food and rest and probably a doctor. Bring her inside, then. Do not just stand there, Mrs. Callahan ordered, and Zinnia felt herself being guided into the house, into warmth and light and the smell of something cooking that made her stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. They settled her into a chair by the fireplace, and Mrs. Callahan, a round woman with gray hair and sharp blue eyes, began fussing over her immediately. She brought warm water and clean cloths and gently washed the dirt from Zinnia's face and hands, clucking her tongue at the bruises and cuts she found. "Who did this to you, child?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Zinnia looked up at her, then over at Tobias, who stood near the doorway giving them space but clearly worried. Something about the genuine concern in both their faces made the words spill out. "My husband died 2 weeks ago," she said. "An accident. His business partner came to collect a debt I did not know existed, and when I could not pay." She touched her face where the worst of the bruises had been. "I ran. I have been running ever since." Mrs. Callahan's expression hardened. "The man's name, Jacob Mercer, in Tucson." Tobias exchanged a look with Mrs. Callahan that Zinnia could not quite read. "I know some people in Tucson," he said quietly. "I will send word. Make sure this Mercer knows you are under protection now. He will not bother you again." "You do not have to do that," Zinnia said. "You have already done so much." "Yes, I do," Tobias said, and there was steel beneath the gentleness now. "What he did was wrong, and you deserve to feel safe." Mrs. Callahan brought soup and bread, and Zinnia ate slowly, forcing herself not to gulp it down despite her hunger. The warmth of the food spread through her body, and with it came a bone-deep exhaustion that made her eyes heavy. "There is a room upstairs," Mrs. Callahan said. "Clean sheets, a real bed. You are going to sleep there tonight and for as many nights as you need until you figure out what comes next." "I cannot impose," Zinnia started to say, but Mrs. Callahan waved her off. "Nonsense. This house has more than enough room, and Tobias here would never forgive himself if he turned you out. Neither would I." She fixed Zinnia with a stern look that somehow managed to be kind at the same time. "You are safe here, child. Whatever you have been through, whatever you are running from, you are safe here now." Zinnia felt tears prick her eyes again, but these were different from the ones she had cried by the creek. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something that felt dangerously close to hope. Mrs. Callahan helped her up the stairs to a small, neat room with a window that looked out over the dark landscape. The bed was soft, the quilts heavy and warm, and Zinnia sank into them like a drowning woman finding shore. She was asleep before Mrs. Callahan even closed the door. She woke several times during the night, disoriented and frightened, her dreams full of Jacob Mercer's face and the sound of her own screaming. Each time she would lie there in the darkness, reminding herself where she was, that she was safe, that the door was locked and there were good people downstairs who would not let anyone hurt her. The last time she woke, the window was showing the first gray hints of dawn. Zinnia got up slowly, her body stiff and aching, and wrapped one of the quilts around her shoulders. She went to the window and looked out at the ranch spreading before her in the growing light. It was beautiful in a rough, honest way. The house sat on a rise overlooking a valley where cattle grazed peacefully. There were several outbuildings, a barn, corrals, and in the distance, the mountains rose up like ancient sentinels. The sky was turning from gray to pink to gold, and Zinnia watched the transformation with something like wonder. She heard footsteps on the stairs and tensed, but then Mrs. Callahan's voice called softly, "Are you awake, dear?" "Yes," Zinnia said. "I am by the window, Mrs." Callahan came in carrying a tray with tea and biscuits. "I heard you moving about," she said. "Thought you might like some breakfast. Thank you." Zinnia took the tea gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "You have been so kind, both of you." "It is nothing more than any decent person would do," Mrs. Callahan said, but her expression softened. "Tobias is a good man. One of the best I have known, and I have known plenty in my 62 years. Lost his parents young, built this ranch up from nothing with his own 2 hands. He has a good heart." Zinnia looked out the window again and saw Tobias emerging from the barn, leading Copper toward the corral. Even from this distance, she could see the easy confidence in the way he moved, the gentle way he handled the horse. Something warm flickered in her chest, something she immediately tried to push away because it was too soon, too complicated, too dangerous to feel anything like that. "He found me when I had given up," Zinnia said quietly. "I was ready to die out there last night. I had nothing left." Mrs. Callahan reached over and squeezed her hand. "But you did not die. You are here and you are alive, and that means there is still a story to tell. Your story is not over, child. It is just beginning a new chapter." Over the following days, Zinnia slowly began to heal. Her body recovered first, the cuts and bruises fading, her strength returning with regular meals and proper rest. The healing of her heart and spirit took longer, was more complicated, involved nightmares and sudden moments of panic when a shadow fell across her path or a door closed too loudly. But through it all, Tobias was there, steady and patient and kind. He never pushed her to talk about what had happened, never asked for anything in return for his help. He simply went about his work on the ranch and made sure she knew she was welcome to stay as long as she needed. Zinnia found herself watching him more than she meant to. She would sit on the porch in the mornings with her tea and observe him working with the horses, his movements sure and confident, his voice low and soothing when he spoke to them. She noticed how he treated his ranch hands with respect, how he never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. She saw the way he would stop to fix a broken fence post or mend a tear in a saddle, taking pride in the work of his hands. One afternoon, about a week after her arrival, Zinnia ventured down to the barn where Tobias was shoeing one of the horses. She stood in the doorway watching him work, the rhythmic clang of hammer on metal echoing in the dim space. "You can come closer if you like," Tobias said without looking up. "I promise Daisy here will not bite." Zinnia stepped inside, drawn by something she could not quite name. "How did you know I was there?" "Heard your footsteps," he said, glancing up with a small smile, "and Daisy's ears flicked in your direction." He patted the mare's shoulder affectionately. "She always knows when someone is watching." "You are good with them," Zinnia observed. "The horses, I mean." "They are honest creatures," Tobias said, going back to his work. "They do not lie or cheat or pretend to be something they are not. If you treat them with respect and kindness, they will give you everything they have." He finished securing the shoe and lowered Daisy's hoof gently. "I wish people were more like horses sometimes." Zinnia moved closer, reaching out tentatively to stroke Daisy's nose. The mare whuffed softly and leaned into the touch. "Can I ask you something, of course?" "Why did you help me?" Zinnia turned to look at him directly. "You do not know me. I could be anyone, could have done anything. Why take that risk?" Tobias straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. He was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes thoughtful. "When I was 17, he said finally, "my parents died in a fire. Our house burned down with them inside. I was out checking the cattle that night, and by the time I got back, there was nothing left but ashes." Zinnia's breath caught. "Tobias, I am so sorry." He nodded, acknowledging her sympathy. "I was alone in the world, no other family, no money, nothing but the clothes on my back and a handful of cattle. I sat in the ashes of that house until dawn, trying to figure out what to do, trying to find a reason to keep going." He looked at her then, his gaze steady and honest. A man named Samuel Carter found me there. He was a rancher passing through, and he could have kept riding, but he did not. He sat with me until the sun came up, and then he offered me work and a place to stay until I got my feet under me. The man who helped you, Zinnia said softly, understanding dawning. Samuel taught me everything I know about ranching, about building a life from nothing, about what it means to be a good man, Tobias said. He died 5 years ago, and I still miss him every day. But before he passed, he told me that the best way to honor what he had done for me was to do the same for someone else when the chance came. So when I saw you by that creek, alone and hurting and hopeless, I knew what I had to do. He met her eyes again. I remembered what it felt like to have someone sit with you through the dark and not leave until the dawn came up again. Tears slipped down Zinnia's cheeks, and she did not bother to wipe them away. "Thank you," she whispered, "for sitting with me through the dark." "You do not have to thank me," Tobias said. "I am just glad I found you when I did." They stood there in the barn with the dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight, and something passed between them that was too large and complex to name. It was not quite romance, not yet, but it was the seed of something that could grow into that and more if given time and care. The weeks passed, and autumn deepened across the Arizona territory. The aspens in the high country turned gold, and the air grew crisp and cold in the mornings. Zinnia made herself useful around the ranch, helping Mrs. Callahan with the cooking and the housekeeping, learning to make bread and preserve vegetables and mend clothes. She found that she enjoyed the simple, honest work, the way it kept her hands busy and her mind focused on something other than the past. Tobias kept his word about sending messages to Tucson regarding Jacob Mercer. Through his contacts, he learned that Mercer had been spreading rumors about Zinnia running mad with grief, just as she had feared. But Tobias made sure the truth got out too, made sure certain influential people knew what Mercer had done. It would not undo the violence, but it meant Mercer's reputation was tarnished, and Zinnia would not have to fear him coming after her. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, Zinnia and Tobias fell into an easy companionship. He would tell her stories about the ranch, about the challenges of raising cattle in this rough country, about his dreams of one day having the finest herd in the territory. She would tell him about her childhood in St. Louis, about learning to paint watercolors from her mother, about the books she had loved to read. They did not talk much about Thomas or about the darker parts of their pasts. Those wounds were still too fresh, too tender to examine in the full light of day. But slowly, carefully, they began to build something new in the space between what had been and what might yet be. One evening in late October, Tobias asked Zinnia if she would like to ride out with him to check on the cattle in the north pasture. The work would take most of the day, and he wanted to make sure she felt comfortable being on a horse for that long. "I would like that," Zinnia said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. They set out the next morning just after sunrise, Zinnia riding a gentle mare named Willow while Tobias rode Copper. The morning was cold and clear, their breath misting in the air, and Zinnia pulled her borrowed coat tighter around herself as they rode. Tobias had given her proper riding clothes, explaining that Mrs. Callahan had a trunk full of things from when she was younger and smaller. The split skirt and warm jacket fit well enough, and Zinnia felt almost like herself again, or perhaps like a new version of herself that was still taking shape. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of saddle leather and the soft thud of hoofbeats on the packed earth. The landscape rolled away in every direction, vast and wild and beautiful. Zinnia had grown up in a city where buildings crowded close together and the sky was a narrow strip overhead. Out here, the sky went on forever, and she felt simultaneously small and infinite beneath its endless blue. "What are you thinking about?" Tobias asked, glancing over at her. "How different everything is out here," Zinnia said. "How big the world feels. In Tucson, even though it was smaller than St. Louis, I always felt like the walls were closing in. But here—" She trailed off, not quite sure how to put it into words. "Here you can breathe," Tobias finished for her, and she nodded. "Yes, exactly that." They reached the north pasture by mid-morning, and Tobias showed her how to count the cattle, how to look for signs of illness or injury, how to identify which cows were pregnant, and when they would likely calve. Zinnia paid attention, asking questions, genuinely interested in learning. It felt good to acquire new skills, to feel competent at something useful. When they stopped for lunch, Tobias built a small fire and they ate the sandwiches and apples Mrs. Callahan had packed for them. The sun was warm despite the chill in the air, and Zinnia tilted her face up toward it, closing her eyes and just feeling the heat on her skin. "You look peaceful," Tobias observed. Zinnia opened her eyes and found him watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. "I feel peaceful," she said. "For the first time in longer than I can remember, I feel like maybe things might be all right." Tobias smiled, and it transformed his whole face, lighting him up from within. "I am glad. Can I ask you something personal?" Zinnia said, emboldened by the privacy of their location and the ease that had grown between them. "You can ask me anything." "Have you ever been married or close to it?" Tobias looked away, poking at the fire with a stick. "There was a woman about 4 years ago, Sarah Bennett. She lived in town and we courted for nearly a year. I thought we would marry, was planning to ask her father for permission." He was quiet for a moment. "But she decided ranch life was not for her. She wanted to move to California, wanted city life and society and things I could not give her. So she married a banker from Phoenix instead." "I am sorry," Zinnia said. "That must have hurt." "It did at the time," Tobias admitted. "But looking back now, I think we wanted different things. She would not have been happy here and I could not be happy anywhere else. Sometimes caring about someone is not enough if you are heading in different directions." Zinnia thought about Thomas, about their brief marriage that had always felt like they were two people occupying the same space, but never quite connecting. "I understand that," she said quietly. "What about you?" Tobias asked. "Were you happy with your husband?" It was a fair question given what she had asked him, but it still made Zinnia's chest tighten. "I thought I was at first. Thomas was kind in his way and he worked hard. But he was always chasing something, always convinced the next deal or the next opportunity would be the one that made us rich. He never stopped long enough to just be with me, to build a life. And then he died, and I realized I was mourning the idea of what we could have been more than what we actually were." Tobias nodded slowly. "That is a hard thing to carry." "What happened after was harder," Zinnia said, and then before she could stop herself, she was telling him everything. About discovering the extent of Thomas's debts, about Jacob Mercer showing up at her door, about the things he had said and done, about how she had waited until he left, and then run into the night with nothing but terror driving her forward. Tobias listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. "I am glad I found you when I did," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "And I am glad that man will not lay a hand on you again. I promise you that, Zinnia. I will not let anyone hurt you while I have breath in my body." The intensity in his words made Zinnia's heart race, but it was not fear this time. It was something else entirely, something warm and bright and terrifying in its potential. "Why?" she asked. "Why does it matter so much to you?" Tobias looked up, and the expression in his dark eyes stole her breath. "Because you matter to me," he said simply. Somewhere between finding you by that creek and watching you learn to smile again, you became important to me. I know it has not been long, and I know you have been through hell and back, and I do not expect anything from you. But I need you to know that you are not alone anymore. You do not have to face anything by yourself unless you want to. Zinnia felt tears prick her eyes for what seemed like the 100th time since arriving at the ranch. But these tears were different yet again, softer somehow, mixed with something that felt almost like joy. You became important to me too, she admitted. I did not want you to. I tried not to let it happen. But somewhere between learning to breathe again and watching you with the horses, I realized that I look forward to seeing you every day. That your smile makes my whole day brighter. That when you are near, I feel safe in a way I have never felt safe before. Tobias stood and came to sit beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, but not so close that it felt invasive or presumptuous. "Can I hold your hand?" he asked, and the fact that he asked, that he did not just take, made Zinnia want to cry all over again. "Yes," she whispered. His hand was calloused and warm, larger than hers, and it enfolded her fingers with a gentleness that belied his strength. They sat like that for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers, not needing to say anything more because the silence between them was full of understanding and promise, and the tentative beginning of something neither of them wanted to rush but both of them hoped would last. The ride back to the ranch was different than the ride out had been. There was a new awareness between them, a current of possibility that hummed just beneath the surface of every word and glance. When they arrived back at the house as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold, Mrs. Callahan took one look at them and smiled knowingly. "Good day checking the herd?" she asked innocently. "Very good," Tobias said, and the warmth in his voice made Zinnia blush. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest Zinnia could remember. She and Tobias continued to spend time together, going on rides, working side by side on ranch chores, sitting by the fire in the evenings while Mrs. Callahan knitted and pretended not to notice the way they looked at each other. The attraction between them deepened into something more substantial, a connection built on shared experiences and genuine respect, and the slow, careful rebuilding of trust. Tobias courted her properly, with all the old-fashioned formality that such things required. He brought her wildflowers from the high meadows. He taught her to rope cattle and shoot a rifle and read the weather in the clouds. He shared his dreams with her, his hopes for the ranch, his desire to build something lasting and good. And in return, Zinnia shared herself, the parts of her that Thomas had never bothered to know, the dreams she had set aside when she married and moved west. One evening in December, as the first snow of winter began to fall, Tobias asked Zinnia to take a walk with him. They bundled up in heavy coats and scarves and ventured out into the crystalline silence of the snowy landscape. Their footsteps crunched on the fresh snow, and their breath misted in clouds around their faces. Tobias led her to the top of the rise behind the house, to a spot where you could see for miles in every direction. The valley below was painted white, and the mountains in the distance were silver-gray against the darkening sky. "This is my favorite place on the whole ranch," Tobias said. "When I need to think, when I need to remember why I do this, I come up here." "It is beautiful," Zinnia said, meaning it absolutely. "Zinnia," Tobias said, turning to face her. He took both her hands in his, and even through their gloves she could feel the warmth of his touch. "I know it has only been a few months since I found you by the creek. I know you have been through more than anyone should have to endure, and I know that the proper thing would be to wait longer to give you more time." He paused, and Zinnia's heart was beating so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. But these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. You are brave and strong and kind, and you make me want to be a better man. You make this ranch feel like a home instead of just a place I work. And I think, if you feel even half of what I feel, then maybe proper timing does not matter as much as honest hearts. Tobias, Zinnia whispered, her eyes filling with tears that the cold immediately froze on her lashes. I am asking if you will marry me, he said, and his voice was steady but his eyes were vulnerable in a way that made her love him even more. Not because you owe me anything or because you need protection or a place to stay, but because I love you, Zinnia Vaughn. I love you with everything I am, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you what love is supposed to look like. I want to build a life with you, raise a family if you want that, grow old watching sunsets from this very spot. I want to be the person you turn to in the darkness and the person who greets you in the dawn. So I am asking, will you marry me? The tears were flowing freely now, but Zinnia was smiling through them, her whole face alight with joy. Yes, she said, and her voice was clear and strong and certain. Yes, Tobias Langford, I will marry you, because I love you too, so much it scares me sometimes. You showed me what it means to be truly seen, truly valued, truly loved. You sat with me through the darkest night of my life, and you stayed until the dawn came up again. And you have been bringing me dawn after dawn ever since. So yes, 1,000 times yes. Tobias pulled her close then, wrapping his arms around her and holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. They stood like that as the snow fell around them. Two people who had found each other in the wilderness and chosen to face whatever came next together. They were married in Eager on a bright, cold morning in January of 1884. The ceremony was small, just a handful of people from town and the ranch hands and Mrs. Callahan, who cried through the entire thing. Zinnia wore a simple dress of deep blue wool, and Tobias wore his best suit, looking handsome and nervous and so full of love that everyone who saw him smile at his bride knew this was the real thing. The preacher, Reverend Matthews, kept the ceremony short but meaningful, speaking about how love was not just a feeling but a choice, a commitment to stand by someone through all the seasons of life. When he asked Tobias if he would take Zinnia as his wife, Tobias's voice was steady and sure. I will, and I do before God and everyone here. When he asked Zinnia the same question, she looked into Tobias's eyes and saw her future written there, saw all the dawns they would share, all the challenges they would face together, all the love they would build between them. I will, and I do with all my heart. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Tobias kissed her with a gentleness that made her heart soar, and the small congregation cheered. They celebrated with a meal at the ranch, Mrs. Callahan having outdone herself with roasted beef and vegetables, and a cake that was slightly lopsided but delicious. There was music and laughter and dancing, and Zinnia thought about how different this was from her first wedding, how much more real and right it felt. As the evening wound down and the guests departed, Tobias and Zinnia stood on the porch watching the stars emerge one by one in the clear winter sky. She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and they were quiet for a long time, just being together in the peaceful silence. "What are you thinking about?" Zinnia asked eventually. "How lucky I am," Tobias said. "How close I came to riding right past that creek the night I found you. What would have happened if I had taken a different path home, if I had been an hour later or earlier?" "But you did not," Zinnia said, tilting her head to look up at him. "You found me exactly when you were supposed to. I do not believe in much anymore after everything I have been through, but I believe in that. I believe you were meant to find me." "Then I believe it too," Tobias said, and he kissed her again, soft and sweet and full of promise. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. Ranch life was hard work, unforgiving in its demands, and there were times when money was tight and the weather was brutal and everything seemed determined to go wrong. But through it all, they had each other. When Zinnia struggled with nightmares from her past, Tobias would hold her until the fear passed, would remind her that she was safe, that no one would hurt her again. When Tobias was overwhelmed by the endless needs of the ranch, Zinnia would help him make lists and plans, would work beside him from dawn until dusk, would remind him that they were building something worthwhile together. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, the way married people do. Tobias learned that Zinnia liked her coffee strong and sweet, that she sang quietly to herself when she was happy, that she had a gift for calming frightened animals. Zinnia learned that Tobias was an early riser who liked to watch the sunrise, that he had a dry sense of humor that could make her laugh even on the hardest days, that he never went to bed angry and would always talk through whatever was bothering him rather than let it fester. In the spring of their first year together, Zinnia discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complex mix of emotions. Joy, certainly, because she and Tobias had talked about wanting children and she knew he would be a wonderful father. But also fear, because she remembered her mother telling her that childbirth was dangerous, that many women did not survive it, and the thought of leaving Tobias alone after he had fought so hard to build a life with her was terrifying. When she told him, Tobias swept her up in his arms and spun her around, laughing with pure delight. Then he set her down carefully, suddenly concerned about being too rough, and she had to laugh at the expression on his face. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she said. "You are not going to break me." I know," Tobias said, but his hands were gentle as he placed them on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby. Zinnia, we are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, even though she could see the answer written all over his face. "I am happier than I ever thought possible," he said. "You have given me everything, Zinnia. A home, a partner, a future, and now a child. I do not have words for how much I love you." "Then show me," she whispered, and he did, with kisses that tasted of joy and promises and forever. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer months. Zinnia continued working around the ranch until she grew too large and uncomfortable, at which point Mrs. Callahan took over, bullying her into resting more. Tobias was attentive to the point of being slightly ridiculous, constantly worrying about whether she was too hot or too cold or working too hard or not eating enough. Zinnia found his concern endearing, even when it drove her a little crazy. In early November, on a night when the wind howled outside and the first real winter storm of the season battered the ranch, Zinnia went into labor. Tobias rode through the storm to fetch the midwife from town, a capable woman named Helen Porter, who had delivered half the babies in the county. Mrs. Callahan stayed with Zinnia, helping her through the contractions, reassuring her that everything was going well. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning. There were moments when Zinnia was sure she could not do it, when the pain was so overwhelming that she wanted to give up. But each time, she would think of Tobias, of the life they were building together, of how he had found her when hope had left her heart and sat with her until the dawn came up. And she would find the strength to keep going. Just after sunrise, as the storm finally broke and weak sunlight filtered through the windows, Zinnia gave birth to a son. He came into the world squalling and red-faced and perfect, and when Helen placed him in Zinnia's arms, she felt a love so fierce and immediate that it took her breath away. Tobias, who had spent the last hour pacing the hallway outside the bedroom like a caged animal, burst through the door the moment Helen called for him. He looked exhausted and terrified and hopeful all at once, and when he saw Zinnia holding their son, his eyes filled with tears. "Is he all right?" Tobias asked, his voice rough. "Are you all right? We are both perfect," Zinnia said, smiling through her own tears. "Come meet your son." Tobias approached slowly, almost reverently, and sat on the edge of the bed. Zinnia carefully transferred the baby into his arms, showing him how to support the tiny head. Tobias looked down at the infant with an expression of such wonder and love that Zinnia fell in love with him all over again. "He is so small," Tobias whispered. "I had no idea they were this small." "He will grow," Zinnia said. "He has your nose." "Poor kid," Tobias said, but he was grinning. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at their son in the golden morning light, Zinnia knew exactly what felt right. "Samuel," she said. "After the man who helped you when you needed it most, Samuel Langford." Tobias looked up at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Samuel," he repeated. "Yes, that is perfect." As they sat there together, the three of them forming a new family, Zinnia thought about how far she had come from that desperate night by the creek. She had been broken then, convinced her story was over, convinced there was nothing left but darkness. But Tobias had found her, had sat with her, had shown her that dawn always comes if you can just hold on through the night. And now here she was, holding their son, surrounded by love and light and the promise of all the dawns yet to come. The years that followed were full and rich, and sometimes difficult, but always worthwhile. Samuel grew into a bright, curious boy who loved the ranch and the animals, and following his father everywhere. When he was 3, Zinnia gave birth to twin daughters, Emily and Rose, who arrived early one spring morning and immediately became the darlings of everyone on the ranch. 2 years after that came another son, Joshua, who was quiet and thoughtful where Samuel was boisterous and active. The ranch prospered under Tobias's careful management and Zinnia's business sense. She kept the books and managed the finances, her quick mind for numbers helping them navigate the ups and downs of cattle prices and market fluctuations. Together they expanded the herd, improved the grazing lands, and built the ranch into one of the most successful operations in the territory. But more than the material success, what they built was a home. A place where their children could grow up safe and loved, where friends and neighbors knew they would always find a warm welcome, where the values of honesty and hard work and compassion were lived out every day. It was exactly what Tobias had dreamed of when he first claimed this land, and more than Zinnia had ever dared to hope for during those dark days in Tucson. Mrs. Callahan stayed with them until she passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by the family she had helped nurture. They buried her on the rise behind the house, next to where Tobias had proposed to Zinnia all those years ago. Even years after her death, the children would bring flowers to her grave and tell her about their lives, keeping her memory alive. When Arizona became a state in 1912, Tobias and Zinnia attended the celebration in Phoenix with their children and grandchildren. By then, their hair had gone gray, and their faces were lined with the marks of a life well lived. But they still held hands like newlyweds, and still looked at each other with that same mix of love and wonder that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Tobias took Zinnia back to the creek where he had found her. It was a warm September evening, much like that night 3 decades before, but everything else was different. They were different, shaped by time and love and the life they had built together. "Do you remember what you told me that night?" Tobias asked as they sat by the water, his arm around her shoulders. "I was so scared," Zinnia said, so lost. I remember thinking I was going to die out here alone. But you did not, Tobias said. You lived. We lived. Look at everything we built, Zinnia. Look at the life we created. I would not have had any of it without you, Zinnia said, leaning her head against his shoulder. You saved me that night, Tobias. In every way a person can be saved. We saved each other, Tobias corrected gently. I was going through the motions before I met you, doing the work but not really living. You gave me a reason to build something more than just a successful ranch. You gave me a family, a future, a reason to greet every dawn with gratitude. They sat there until the stars came out, talking about their children and grandchildren, about the challenges they had faced and overcome, about the hopes they still held for the years ahead. And when the night grew cold, they rode back to the ranch together, to the house full of light and life and love, to the home they had built from nothing but hope and determination, and the promise that dawn always comes if you can hold on through the darkness. Zinnia Langford lived to be 86 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who all knew the story of how their grandfather had found their grandmother by a creek when hope had left her heart, how he had sat with her until the dawn came up again, and how that single act of compassion had created a legacy of love that would endure for generations. Tobias followed her 2 years later, passing peacefully in his sleep in the house he had built with his own hands. They buried him next to Zinnia on the rise behind the house, where you could see for miles in every direction, where the sky stretched endless overhead, and the land rolled away in waves of gold and green. The family carved both their names on a single stone, along with the words that best summed up their lives together. They found each other in the darkness and walked toward the dawn hand in hand. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through the generations, and with it the story of how it all began. Of a cowboy who chose compassion over convenience, who saw someone in need and stopped to help even though it would have been easier to ride on. Of a woman who found the courage to keep living even when everything seemed lost, who built a new life from the ashes of the old. Of two people who found each other at exactly the right moment and chose to build something beautiful together. And every year on the anniversary of that night by the creek, the family would gather at the ranch for a celebration. They would tell the story again for the youngest ones, keeping it alive, keeping the memory of Tobias and Zinnia's love burning bright. They would watch the sunset from the rise behind the house, and they would remember that no matter how dark the night becomes, dawn always comes to those who can hold on just a little longer, to those who are willing to sit with each other through the darkness and wait together for the light.